believe we're starting. I'm Leslie Wheeler, and this is Critical Theory and Speculative Fiction 101. We're very happy to be here, and I want to say that we have a very brilliant and accomplished set of people to talk about this question, but we are missing Michael Sisko, who's on the program, and we're not quite sure why, and we're hoping he's going to pop in soon. So a few bits of housekeeping. We're going to take turns talking about the kinds of theory that we find interesting or provocative as readers and as writers, and for some of us as teachers. But we want to make lots of room for questions. We want this to be as dynamic a conversation as it would be if we were live, to whatever extent is possible. So if you have questions, please put them in Discord in main track number 2, and a Readercon staff member is going to transfer them to our Zoom chat, and we'll see them and we'll be able to address them. There is a 20-second lag between when this airs and when we're talking, so feel free to put those questions in at any time. And we will join hallway chat number 2 after the panel to continue the conversation with anybody who wants to do that. We're going to start with self-introductions and talk about why we're here, what kinds of writing and reading we do, with an emphasis on how it might connect to the topic of the panel. And I'll start briefly by saying I'm Leslie Wheeler. My first novel out last year is Unbecoming, and it's speculative fiction with elements of academic satire. And I am somebody who earned a PhD in English in the 90s when theory was ascendant. And so that was the world I swam in. And I think at that point, I was really interested in feminist theory and very skeptical of everything else. In the last 10 years, though, I've been reading a lot of newer developments, and I've found a lot of material that's been very exciting to me. I gave myself a crash course on theoretical and critical approaches to speculative fiction that helped me develop courses, as well as a forthcoming essay collection called Poetry's Possible Worlds. So I'm also a poet. I'm also really interested in, I do research on poetry, and I'm interested in those things too. I'm also fascinated by ecocriticism, narrative theory, queer theory, and cognitive approaches to literature, but I say that, and I'm not an expert on any of them. So I'm somebody who dips in and gets excited about things and then moves on. So Jean Cavellos, do you want to tell us where you're coming from?
Sure. I started out in astrophysics working at NASA, but I had a fascination with science fiction. So I got my MFA in creative writing, got a job in publishing, worked my way up to senior editor at Bantam Doubleday Dell. Worked on horror, fantasy, and science fiction, and won the World Fantasy Award for my editing. I left publishing to focus on my own writing and work in a more meaningful way with writers. So I'm the author of 7 books, and to help writers improve, I started the Odyssey Writing Workshops Charitable Trust, which offers a 6-week workshop for writers of the fantastic each summer. When there's not a pandemic, it's in New Hampshire, and when there is, we're online. And Odyssey also offers things like critiques and consultations and online classes and lots of free resources at odysseyworkshop.org. I write mainly science fiction, but it usually has a little bit of horror in it, or a lot of bit of horror in it. I read fiction of all sorts. Some recent stuff I read, I Know This Much Is True by Wally Lamb, Lincoln and the Bardo by George Saunders, Emma by Jane Austen, and The Curse of Chalion by Lois McMaster Bujold. So I'm like all over the place. And I also read about 100 books on writing each year to help keep Odyssey really helpful to writers and improve my own work. And those include a lot of how-tos, as well as genre theory and narrative theory. A couple of interesting books I read recently are Unnatural Narratives, Unnatural Narratology, Writing in the Dark by Tim Wagner, Epistolarity approaches to form, production of emotions, perspectives, and functions, the elements of surprise. So lots of, to me, really, really interesting theory that helps me to understand genre and writing better. And kind of like Leslie, I like dipping my toe into a lot of ponds and exploring and seeing what I can learn and how I can apply that. Thanks.
And I believe I'm next. I'm Tom Green. Let's see, I started out intending to be a biologist, but sort of took a left turn into English literature when I went to college because my English grades were slightly better than my math grades. And I've always been interested in science fiction and sort of pursued the English literature track, and went to graduate school in Massachusetts. I grew up in South Texas, but got an MFA in creative writing, didn't see any jobs around, went ahead and got a PhD in Victorian literature, which was really fun. But the critical underpinning that I used for that was cultural studies, which is a derivative of capital C critical theory, which is about sort of looking at the ideological subtext and the cultural effects of literature. Because like everybody else, like a lot of other people, I grew up on formalism and new criticism, which is not my favorite kind of criticism. But this type of cultural studies is much more fun to do. And so it carried me through the 13 years of graduate school. And now I'm a professor at a community college in New England, where I teach a little bit of literature, but mainly writing, both creative and non-creative. Is there non-creative writing? And live in an old Victorian house with a couple of cats. I usually, my reading pattern usually follows fixating on a particular author and reading everything I can find by that author and then moving on to the next one. So I recently finished up my George Saunders phase. Especially enjoyed his book about writing, which I highly recommend, Swim in the Pond in the Rain. And then I've made a little side detour through a couple of, I'm forgetting his name, but right now I'm in the middle of Ian McLeod. So I write mainly science fiction, actually only science fiction, hard science fiction, most of which gets published in analog, although I have a few other things here and there, Inner Zone, Strange Horizons. And my science fiction deals with mainly these same kinds of cultural issues that are embedded in the kind of criticism that I do with my students in class, and the folklore and the fairy tales and the Victorian men's adventure fiction that I studied for my dissertation. Thanks.
Gene Mirabelli. I'm Gene Mirabelli. And this is an extremely intimidating panel I find myself on, I must say. I guess the most significant thing about me is that I'm old. I was born during the waning years of the administration that preceded Roosevelt, so that puts me farther back. And my acquaintance with critical theory comes because I'm an academic. I grew up, had a very happy childhood as far as I can tell, and I wanted to be a painter, actually, not a writer. But my science grades and my interest in science caused me to go to MIT. And after a couple of years there, I felt like throwing myself in the river. Fortunately, I threw my books in the river and thought I'd enter art school, but it turns out that artists and painters are they're not very talkative, actually. And I had discovered I like to talk and I like to write. So I transferred, I went to Harvard for a couple of years, then drifted around for a few years, did all sorts of jobs. Eventually, after 2 years, wound up at Hopkins in a writing program down there, and began writing professionally. While I was teaching there, I was also writing book reviews for the Baltimore Sun. And I guess I've written just about any kind of writing that is possible to write. I've written advertising copy and stuff like that. And I've written reports for the Corps of Engineers. At any rate, I worked around, eventually went to Harvard again, got a PhD there. By that time, I knew I wanted to be a writer. And the idea was to get a degree that would permit me to live, because I knew I couldn't make a living simply by writing novels. And it turned out I was right. It was a good thing I did get the degree. I have written 9 novels. They're what I call straight novels. They're not science fiction. But I don't believe in genre for a writer. And I also wrote a story that I couldn't get published. Well, in the academic world, it was called Magical Realism. And I could publish it in a small magazine, a little literary magazine, and that would be the end of it. It would be dead. But I discovered that if I published it, as I did, in the magazines of science fiction and fantasy, then I could read online all sorts of reactions to it. It's an incredible audience that reads science fiction. And I do believe that some of the finest writing in the country today is actually being published in magazines, such as the magazine of science fiction and fantasy or Analog or any of the others. And the online magazines, of course, too. I don't want to leave them out. But I'm a science fiction writer not by accident. I actually wrote science fiction. My first science fiction story was published when I was at MIT in an undergraduate magazine there. At any rate, in the academic world, I became acquainted with all these different critical theories. As Tom said, the dominant theory when I was in graduate school, and apparently it's still there, and when he went to graduate school, was what was it called? New criticism, which separates the literature from everything else. Instead of from feminism or Marxism or anything. It's just there all by itself. Well, that's what I thought, but I became acquainted naturally with the other theories, not to the degree that Jean Kevelos is, or Leslie, or I suspect Tom, but enough to know that it was very interesting. Now, I must say, I'm not in total agreement with the other panel members here in the idea that it's essential. It is for the writer, that is to say, essential only to the degree, I believe, only to the degree that it makes the writer find his authentic self. I think growing up in society by necessity imposes a sense of self on us individuals so that we can become cooperative members of society. But that's to some degree an inauthentic self. As when I'm teaching a class that has Asian Americans, African Americans, all sorts of communities, Jewish communities, Islamic communities, they're in my classroom. And we're discussing a piece of literature, and we all approach it as though we were somehow connected to each other and didn't have the differences that we do indeed have. But critical theory can free you to a degree so that you can find your authentic self. And that did happen to me when I entered graduate school. And I was a little sick and tired of English literature because my house wasn't filled with Chaucer and Shakespeare. It had Dante in it. I grew up with these great Italian works, and I was told that I was an inheritor of this other tradition. It was then I decided I would major in American literature, and very quickly discovered I was an Italian American, and very quickly discovered this whole world that would not destroy, but have a different view of the society and the culture I lived in. And I think I've spoken enough now.
Well, that's great. And it sends us off on a lot of different avenues. And one of the things that you just said that I think about a lot is the disciplinary boundaries that academia imposes, right? That would I specialize in English, meaning work first written in English, as if that doesn't exist in a larger intellectual and artistic ecosystem, right? So I think that a lot of the ways that we think about critical theory are influenced and shaped by those disciplinary boundaries. And a lot of people who write SF are people who are deeply interdisciplinary. And I heard that in everybody's bios too, that people are interested in the gray zones and the overlaps and the contradictions between fields. The next thing I asked each panelist to speak to is to pick some fragment of theory that you've read that's been either exciting to you or maybe problematic? There's so many things to choose from, but I chose a bit from a book that I encountered a couple of years ago by a scholar who's a medievalist named Carolyn Dinshaw. Now, I specialize in 20th, 21st century poetry as a scholar, so that's about as far from my field as you can get within the discipline of English. But she's interested in medieval texts and their post-medieval readers, especially amateur medievalists. And so in that book, she's advocating for the attachments of fandom versus the detachments of academic specialists. And that's something that appeals to me a lot. I tend to get excited by theory and criticism that questions the terms of its own existence. And I don't know to what extent I'm resisting theory or participating in theory by then, because the history of theory is so much as a history of overthrows, right?
Exactly.
I feel like I value expertise, but I also think it's counterproductive to think that literature is something that only professionals are qualified to talk about. And as Jean said, that's one of the things that makes a community like this one so dynamic, is that people don't believe that everybody feels like they're entitled to their fandom and they can speak to it, and audiences and conversations become richer. So here's a little quote from Carolyn Dinshaw's book, How Soon Is Now? Medieval Texts, Amateur Readers, and the Queerness of Time. Though I feel I have achieved my fullest incarnation here as a professional, so meaning here in this book published by Scholarly Press, writing a book with reams of endnotes, I also feel a kinship with the amateur that I can only call queer. Like my queerness, my feelings of amateurism aren't a stage of development, aren't ever going to go away. I study books because I really love them, and I find Carolyn Dinshaw's profession of really loving them, of being a fan as well as a scholar, really moving. So, Jean Cavellis, you want to talk a bit to the questions?
Sure. As you said, it's very hard to pick one quote, but I decided to pick something that was early in my reading of genre criticism and really just made me aware of, opened this whole new world to me of insights that I could gain about genre by reading genre criticism, and just blew me up this whole new world. So this is an oldie but a goodie, I think, from Darko Suvin. And he says, science fiction is a literary genre whose necessary and sufficient conditions are the presence and interaction of estrangement and cognition, and whose main formal device is an imaginative alternative to the author's empirical experience. This also appealed to me as a scientist because it's a very kind of scientific definition. And I was like, what the heck is he talking about? I had no clue the first time I read it. It's like, I don't know what he's talking about, but I took it apart and I studied it and I tried to understand it. And I came to an understanding of it that really changed the way I looked at science fiction. I never thought about estrangement and cognition as like major elements of science fiction, which clearly they are. Estrangement, you start reading a story and oh my gosh, it's strange. You're in a strange place. You're in a strange planet. You're on a spaceship. You're somewhere and it's strange. That's estrangement. And then cognition, you use your thought process, your brain, to try to figure out what the heck is going on. What is this planet like? Why are they all doing this thing that they're doing? Where did Soylent Green come from? You start asking these questions and trying to work out. And so in a way, science fiction is a lot like mystery, because in mystery, you say, hey, there's a dead body. How did that body get to be dead? Let me try to figure it out. And I never saw, any similarity between science fiction and mystery before reading this quote and starting to think about it. Fantasy can also have this, but generally you feel the estrangement in fantasy, but you don't question it. You just accept it. You're like, oh, that's the way the world is. They have dragons, they have this, they have that. And that was one thing that was really weird to me about like Song of Ice and Fire, is that it really activated my cognition in that I was trying to figure out, why does the length of the years and the seasons change? There must be a reason for that. Is there a God doing it? Is there a planetary arrangement that's doing it? And I was waiting and waiting and waiting for an explanation. And I guess I'm still waiting and hoping, because that really intrigues me. That's like one of the things I'm most interested in that story, even though it's fantasy. And maybe that's because George also writes science fiction, that it has that kind of flavor to it. Anyway, so that opened a lot of doors for me as I started to read more genre criticism and learn more about what the different genres can do and how we can, mix and match, as Leslie was saying, and break the rules and overturn the rules and make them what we want. But it's wonderful to like have new avenues of thought. And that's what that quote gave for me.
My turn. And not to start off by bashing on formalism again, but new criticism, as it was called at the time, but now that's confusing to call it new criticism because it was mid 20th century. Also called formalism is actually, there's a cultural studies reading of criticism. One of the things about cultural studies that is innovative, I think, is that it's this idea that really is most clearly expressed by Roland Barthes, that anything can be a text. And Roland Barthes has an essay on the haircuts in the Julius Caesar movie, or an essay on the direction that you point your pie, and with the way Americans point their pie toward their stomach, and Europeans point their pie off to the side. And the way that these are phenomena in society that can be read as texts. What is the significance of pointing the piece of pie in a particular way? And so it applies to literally everything. I've had students push back on me on this idea with me in class and ask me, are you saying there's nothing without meaning? And I say, yeah, there is nothing that you can't read as a text under cultural studies. And the cultural studies reading of formalism is this idea that because it was mid 20th century, the McCarthy trials were happening. And so there was a big motivation for academics to try and stay out of politics. And so formalism is that view of literature that says literature is not political. It's just about the form. It's about these things that you get quizzes on in your high school classes in public school, like I went to, about, what does the green light at the end of the dock mean symbolically? That's, I think, the most popular question in all of high school literature. And it's a multiple choice too, right? What is in The Great Gatsby, what does the light at the end of the dock mean? But you can ask those kinds of questions in cultural studies, but you can also ask questions like about the strangeness, the kind of strangeness that Jean Cavallis was just talking about, where you come across something in a work of literature like the scene in Rider Haggard's She, where they go out and shoot 100 elephants in Africa for no particular reason. They just stampede them and shoot them dead. And that makes you question, why is this scene? This is one of the most popular books of the 19th century, She by Rider Haggard. Why is there a scene of massacring elephants pointlessly and then leaving them lying in the veldt? Why does this commercial? I wrote a paper on this. Why do all these breakfast cereal commercials have these mythical trickster figures in them? It leads to all these wonderful questions. Why are vampires sexy? Is a presentation that I do around the Merrimack Valley. And it's kind of a little bit out of date now, but there was that sort of era when sexiness became a feature of vampirism. And so that the classic work of cultural studies is Robert Darnton's book, The Great Cat Massacre, which is a kind of a cultural examination of a medieval event in which some apprentices went out and massacred a bunch of cats. So if you're a person who's sensitive to animal killing, then you don't want to read this book. But it meant something to the medieval French people who did it. These apprentices, it reflected something about their society and their beliefs and their ideologies and their values. And you can sort of unpack that as a historical text and read and try to figure out what that means. And then this technique can be applied to anything in society to sort of try and get at the underlying ideologies. And I think to go back to something that Jean Mirabelli said a second ago, on my screen I have a Jean on either side, so it's this way. I keep pointing this way. The Jean Mirabelli said about the how essential theory is to you when you're composing, and I would just sort of piggyback on that and say that maybe not so much when composing, but during revision, which the revision, which is at least 99% of the labor of producing a good piece of work, is that you can use the sort of critical view of your own writing in retrospect to see what you've got down, to make sure that you are aligning with the ideologies that you want to align with, and not so much with the, that you're not accidentally writing a white savior narrative or something like that without even being aware of it. I'm sorry, go ahead, Gene.
Yeah, I agree with you on that point, that last point of being aware of what you're doing. Just to go back just a moment to the business of having a quote that we're going to start, a text to start with. Mine was from Derrida, and whose writing I don't particularly care for. I think he doesn't know how to write. Maybe it's a translation, I don't know. But the quote is, "What cannot be said, above all, must not be silenced, but written," which I think is absolutely true, of course. And it's precisely those things which have to be written. And Gene, you were mentioning genre, and I think that's fascinating. My last few novels have won a modest prize from a modest from the Independent Publishers Association, whatever it's called, for literary fiction. Which is the kiss of death in one sense, but they include nonetheless chapters which were published, a couple of them in amazing what is it called, Fantasy and Science Fiction magazine. So there they are in literary fiction. And although I'm very pleased with the work, the last book that was published, my publisher took 3 of my works and put them together into one volume, which is a staggering 600 pages, published at the height of the pandemic. It's just not a wise thing to do. But the straight book begins when a man in Sicily walks into his bride's bedroom, and he's dressed only in the shirt he got married in, and it's revealed that from the waist down, he's a stallion. Well, that's not exactly straight fiction. And one of the women in the novel is essentially Aphrodite, is working in a bordello on the other side of the island. But I don't see any particular conflict. I don't think any of the readers, nor the critics, have found any conflict there. But there's a great conflict in the concept of separate genres. I think genres can be useful when you're going into a bookstore and you want to buy a mystery story, you want to buy some detective fiction, or you want to buy science fiction, and you can go down this aisle or go over here. But I think for a writer, I don't think those boundaries should exist. Now, in terms of the usefulness of critical theory for writers, I think critical theory is a two-edged sword. It can be very helpful, but it can be very destructive. In a destructive way, you can see the results in the 1930s, which is part of the reason that new criticism and formalism developed. In the 1930s, there was a big push for the common man, for the proletariat. In what later became the Soviet Union, it was Marxism. In this country, it was called, I don't know what it was called, in this country, it was extreme left. Sometimes it was a communist party. But the result in literature was the production of a lot of proletarian novels, which are really lousy books. I mean, because you've got characters who are acting out exactly the roles that the theory says the proletariat should act out. And this is the way to write propaganda. Propaganda is the ultimate bad effect of critical theory, whether it's a novel about women, a novel in which women are self-actualizing independent characters who are capable of doing all sorts of wonderful things, and men are brutes or oppressors. That's not the way the world, well, some people would say that's just the way the world is. I'm only showing you the truth, I'm sorry. But I consider that propaganda. Now, to the degree that critical theory can free you from the socially imposed concept of who you are, it's useful for a writer. I think it's essential for a writer. I can't I can't imagine it any other way. But it can also turn you into a propagandist if it's carried too far. One of the nice things about critical theory is in small c and small l and small t is that there are so many of them. And I found when I was teaching, of course, if I'm teaching The Great Gatsby, it isn't only about the green light at the end of the dock. It's also about Daisy's passivity and the men fighting over Daisy. But believe me, well, of course you do believe me. I mean, Fitzgerald was not writing propaganda. He was not writing a feminist novel any more than Hemingway was when he wrote A Farewell to Arms. And there's a very, very, very passive woman in it and very active guy in it. You can talk about the books. It would not be material to use Marxist criticism it seems to me, while talking about A Farewell to Arms. But it might be very useful to use Marxist criticism while talking about The Great Gatsby. So you apply different critical theories to the text that you have in front of you, it seems to me. Some of them are going to be more productive than others. And indeed, some parts of literature seem to resist, or we haven't developed interesting critical theories in order to talk about them in our classes. I think I've made my point, whether it's agreeable.
It's interesting. If I could just jump in real quick with a quick comment, is that I'm realizing now that something that happens when I'm teaching a fiction writing class, as somebody who also teaches literature, is that sometimes I deliberately sometimes sort of code switch.
Yes.
And I tell my students, okay, I'm putting on my English professor hat now, and I'm going to talk about this theme that I think is not working in your story. But it is a very different dialect, or a very different what's the word I'm looking for? Discourse from when I have my fiction writing teacher hat on, which is much more at the craft level.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm moving back and forth between those two modes too. And I'm really fascinated by this question because I think that it's been very clear to me that, at least I only teach undergraduates. I teach at a liberal arts college. So it's very clear to me that bits and pieces of theory can be really great generators of classroom discussion and sometimes of student writing, essay writing, right? Like that they give them terms and concepts sometimes to fight back against. But in the creative writing classroom or working with writers in other contexts, the way that the Odyssey workshop does is, it plays a different role, and one wants to be very sure that you're not prohibiting so much as giving permission, right? So, I can say that when I started reading genre theories more deliberately, something that I got really excited about in narrative theory was it made clear to me, maybe more than had been before, that genres are really marketing categories. They're driven by sales, and
Sure.
and that there's nothing inherent in a text.
Right.
Like I was reading a book called Heterocosmica by a guy named Dolezal probably, and then there's Narrative as Virtual Reality by somebody named Marie Laura Ryan. And I found these books really exciting because one of the things that they were saying is that all books construct alternate possible worlds. So there's nothing inherent in the book that can tell you whether it's realistic or fantastic, right? That's all books are fantastic. All fiction is inherently made up. And you might be able to talk about degrees or resemblances, like this resembles the world I live in more, but there's nothing intrinsic in the text that tells you absolutely what its genre is. And for me, that gave me permission. That gave me ways to think about writing work that didn't necessarily adhere to formulas. I'd be really interested to hear about that from you, Jean Cavellas, as somebody who is working with so many writers through those workshops that you do.
Yeah, well, I think we have seen more and more mixing of genres and interstitial works and slipstream works and whatever you want to call them, works that mix genre elements, works that are both literary and genre at the same time. And I think that's a great thing. I mean, that's added a lot to what we can learn from, where we can go. I think, you can definitely look at different traits of a story and say, well, these traits are more common in this genre and less common in that genre. But I encourage writers that I work with, to always try to find what speaks to them and to write about those things. Lots of times I find writers are just writing in a genre because that's their default genre. And so everything has got, a secondary fantasy land, and everything's got dragons, and everything's medieval, or whatever it may be, that they read a lot in that subgenre, and that they just automatically put every story they think of into that genre. Whereas that may not be the best genre to write that story. If you have a story that maybe you have a particular theme, or you have a character, or you have a problem that the character is going to be struggling with, what's the best milieu for telling that story? What's the best type of plot structure for that story? Like, you want to think about all the possibilities instead of narrowing yourself down into these little categories. And to me, that's something that I think you can get out of reading genre criticism, is that you can just see the different possibilities. For example, people get down on Tolkien for saying, fairy stories must have fantasy, recovery, escape, and consolation. Those are the 4 pleasures you must provide in a fairy story or fantasy story. And it's like, well, of course you don't have to, but those are in some stories. What pleasures do you want to provide? Like, to me, that opened up the whole gate of, what pleasures am I trying to provide to my readers? What kind of story is this? Is this the kind of story where I want to keep them turning the pages at 2 a.m. and in horrible suspense? Or is it the kind of story where I want them to linger over imagining the characters? Are they going to get together, or are they not going to get together? There's so many different pleasures you can provide. And so thinking about certain genres tend to gravitate more toward providing particular pleasures, like, wonder and awe with science fiction. They always say that doesn't mean you have to do that. That doesn't mean you can't provide wonder and awe in a horror story or in a mystery or whatever. But it gives you different possibilities to mix up. So to me, it just opens those possibilities, as long as you take it that way. You can take it any way you want to.
There's a question in the chat that's relevant to this. This question of genre. Question: with the great increase of mixed genre fiction, how do you feel about bookstore sections returning to a general fiction section in alphabetical order by author name, where different genre fictions and literary fictions are all mixed up?
Well, there was another one about the genre and marketing, and we're talking about bookstores. So when we talk about bookstores, we're talking about markets. We're talking about markets. And I think it's useful for a person who, as Jean said, there are all sorts of different pleasures, and some people want a certain kind of pleasure. The value of dividing them into genres is you'll be able to seek out that particular pleasure to a greater degree if you choose this kind of an aisle to go down rather than that aisle to go down. I think that I can't agree more. I mean, I'm very happy with the people here we seem to be agreeing with each other. I thought we were going to kill each other.
Well, what about libraries, though? It's a public institution that is sorting books in such a way that people can go and find the books that they're interested in looking at. Isn't there a kind of a political agenda there with putting the science fiction books in one section?
Well, my library doesn't do that, though. I thought you were, as a matter of fact, I thought you were raising a very interesting question. A library is a kind of bookstore that doesn't have genre. At least the library, my local library, is just books. The children's section, well, that's graded by age, really. I don't know. I remember when the internet first began, it was possibly, there was no Google. It was like going into a library with a flashlight. There was no catalog, and you could find interesting things by accident, but you couldn't find what you were looking for. So I think bookstores help you find what you're looking for. Now, I agree entirely with Jean that it's marvelous to be free from the notion that the genres have got stone walls between them, that you can mix them, that you should whenever you need to. Yes, I think we should be free as writers, but I think readers make selections. I think as a horrible analogy I'm about to make, but as a chef, we can prepare all sorts of meals, but the person who comes into the restaurant is going to choose one. They're not going to choose all of them, but they can have a variety. I don't know what more to say. I think we were in agreement about this, and that our differences are marginal here. But
yeah, I think that, oh, go ahead, Jean.
I was just going to say, as far as, marketing and selling books, putting them all together gives you the chance that someone who doesn't normally read fantasy or science fiction may find your book. On the other hand, it also gives you the chance that those who are looking for fantasy and science fiction can't find your book because it's among so many other books.
Exactly.
Whereas if it was in a separate section, then they could more easily find it. So there's, either way, you have problems.
Well, I came across Jules Verne as a kid by accident. Marvelous science, one of the first science fiction writers. It was just an accident, totally an accident. And I was reading something called A Mysterious Island. And an adult came into the living room in my house where I was reading the book and said, "Oh, Jules Verne, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea." And I said, "What's that?" He said, "That's another book by Jules Verne." So I began to read 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And then I found this whole world that Verne had created, and I guess that was the first time I became interested in science fiction as a reader. But I think, yeah.
Yeah, we all need those accidents. There's sometimes, I've been through a probably partly pandemic inspired phase of mysteries, and particularly that genre has helped me when my concentration is low cope with the world. And so I have gone looking deliberately for mysteries, but you don't always want to read in your comfort zone, which is sometimes why the theory is worth reading, because it disrupts some of the things you thought you knew.
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
I was a regular professor. I've been retired for years now, and I taught regular literature courses, but I also taught a creative writing course. And eventually the university that I was teaching at eventually had a graduate program in writing, as a matter of fact. So I wound up teaching a writing course every semester. And I agree with the importance of what we're talking, critical theory. But at one point we had a tenure meeting for a faculty member whose focus was critical theory. That person had been hired specifically to teach critical theory. And somebody, not me, but somebody else who had taught creative writing said that the graduate students were getting overwhelmed with critical theory and were becoming inhibited. I see you nodding your head, and you did too. This is very interesting. As I said, it's a two-edged sword. It's very curious. You've got to write. you've got to write about people. You've got to write about people. You can't write propaganda. And I just don't know how to handle it. How better, there may be a better way of talking about that particular problem for writers. It isn't a problem, at least I don't think so. It's not, or I'm happy writing the way I'm writing, and I'm mixing the genres whenever it seems to me to be useful, or whenever I can have fun doing it. Also, my writing has to give me pleasure, otherwise I don't do it. And anything that I'm writing, if it bores me, it sure as hell is going to bore a reader. And that's one of the tests that I use when I'm writing. What were you going to say? Can I ask Tom what he was?
Yeah.
I was nodding because there's a famous couple of studies that show that the longer you go to graduate school, the less well you perform on tests of creativity.
I believe that instinctively.
And since I personally was in graduate school for 13 years, it kind of worries me.
Well,
There's a lot of lead around when I was a kid too, though. So what can you do?
I've written on one scholarly paper in my life. It was for a British encyclopedia. And I wrote a passage on Vladimir Nabokov. But other than that, I taught at the university. I taught at the State University of New York in Albany for about 35 years or so, 30, I've forgotten how long. And the reason I wound up there was because they told me that my fiction would be accepted as a publication. Because when I was looking for a job, when it was difficult for a writer to get a position in an English department. They love literature, they just didn't like writers.
Yeah, and now writers are way more hireable than traditional scholars because that's what students want. They want the writing classes. Yeah, I mean, there are all these disciplinary hostilities that this conversation sort of fits uneasily into, right? The hostility from sort of traditional fields of English scholars of those fields, sometimes to theorists, from theorists to creative writers. Creative writers are often really hostile to genre. I've known a ton of creative writing professors who have forbidden any genre elements from appearing in stories, right? So
you're right.
Yeah.
It happens also in something like I used to see it occasionally in the letters to the editor from the Authors Guild. This was many years ago. It doesn't occur now. But writers of literary fiction would look down on writers of genre fiction. I have nothing but admiration for people who can earn a living as a writer, no matter what they're writing.
Yeah. So there are more great questions than we're going to be able to answer here. We're going to have to move over to Discord soon, but there's a question about whether estrangement is unique to SF. It seems common to all literature, not just SF and fantasy. There's a question about breakfast cereal tricksters, which I look forward to talking.
I can give the reference. There's a scholarly article in the Journal of Popular Culture, I believe, from 2002 that I wrote. So just look in the Journal of Popular Culture under my name, and you can find the whole article on the history of breakfast cereals and tricksters.
Great. Yeah, we will be doing that. And there's another question about where to start if you want to read genre theory. So does anybody want to talk about that genre theory question or the estrangement question in our last 2 minutes?
Sounds like a Darko Suvin question.
Yeah, it does.
I'm happy to talk about estrangement. I agree with the questioner that I think estrangement occurs in a lot of fiction, especially I hate to say like really good fiction, but a lot of really good fiction will have estrangement because it will offer you a unique view of things. So say we're in a first person point of view, that character is going to see the world in a certain way. And if that character sees the world in a way that's you've kind of read before, urban fantasy, I'm talking about you, then it's not terribly compelling or estranging. But if that first person viewpoint is seeing the world in a way you've never seen before or has some new elements to it, then it's estranging and it can be fascinating and really pull you through the story. So that can happen in any genre. So I agree with you. I think what Darko Suvin is saying is particularly prevalent in science fiction, certainly not exclusive to science fiction, is the combination of the estrangement and cognition and the imaginative alternative to the author's empirical experience. So we're in a new place, unlike our world, and we have estrangement, and we have cognition. We're trying to figure it out, and our attempts to figure it out are rewarded by things that are going to be in the story, revelations that are going to come out in the story about the world.
We have to stop there. So I just want to ask everybody to please head to hallway chat 2. And thank you to brilliant panelists. This has been a great conversation and not a brawl, which is great.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.
Absolutely
Thank you.
wonderful.
I think we're done, but this was really great. And
thanks.
yeah. Let's keep talking.
Well, we could keep. Can we?
No, I think they need this channel. So